So back before the release of Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance, I made a video called 6 Hopes for SMT V Vengeance, where I outlined the 6 things that I hoped would be the case in this re-release. I thought all 6 were fairly reasonable, and so focused on them as opposed to other, much more needed improvements that may not have been achievable given that the new content is being pasted on an already created game, such as rewriting, or technically just writing, the original canon of creation so as to have a cohesive vision without plot holes or other inconsistencies start to finish. Something that the original was riddled with. Plot points are risen only to be either dropped, contradicted, or settled in side quests. Miyazu comes to mind as the most obvious example, and unfortunately is also the perfect example to showcase how Vengeance failed to truly break free from these constraints by instead retreading them. What happens to Miyazu after Yuzuru's fate in the canon of Vengeance? Go talk to Konsu to begin a boss battle to find out, same as in the original canon of creation. It's frustrating and showcases the issues that were inherent, but which I can now optimistically say may not be as detrimental to SMT 6, given some of the improvements that were in SMT V Vengeance gives me hope that this was just a fluke, a bad game, even if it may be the second, but not an ongoing trend as I originally believed. Before getting into a more detailed analysis of where this new game begins and ends, I felt that I would revisit that list and see which of my hopes came to pass, which did not, and how they were implemented, and whether or not I have any addendums to add to my previous points. This is the 6 things that I hoped for in SMT V Vengeance, and here's what each is like in the game we got. And just because I am ferociously behind schedule and put this video together kind of last minute, there is going to be minimal editing just like in the original. Fair warning. Nope, the tutorial is still bad. Not allowing the player to do anything else but what the game needs you to do for the tutorial. Something that I noticed was actually redundant given the design of the early field and the fact that everything could have been alleviated in simple to implement ways. Rather than forcibly backtracking after getting the first Mimin, simply immediately switching to the cutscene and then placing the protagonist back where they had been would have made that stretch feel far less forced, for instance. And the same can be said for the combat and negotiation tutorials as well, as neither are especially complicated to get a grasp of. The press turn system is a wonderfully fluid and simple system to grasp from trial and error alone, and I stand by that a tutorial this aggressive in forcing the player into only specific actions to get an understanding of the thing that the game says you can do in a pop-up is just an insult to the intelligence of the player, as if they can't read or can't put 2 and 2 together by just trying each option in the menu screen. Negotiations are slightly more understandable since it becomes a lot easier to play the game with a demon in stock to increase the turn count, but there are much better ways to introduce this, done in better games before, so I still stand by that this was unnecessary. Pixie from Nocturne needs the protagonist's help and so joins for a mutual goal and can stick around if you make the right decision. And in 4, the act of trying to negotiate with enough demons to get a full party is a literal quest, the game challenging you to achieve this and making it feel rewarding when accomplished rather than annoying that I had to go through the ordeal, especially given how pointless it was to endure. Quite honestly, skipping the tutorial wholly and instead just letting the player do whatever they wanted with the freedom to explore that is the appeal of an open world is probably the barest minimum to a game design in that respect, and thus it is disappointing that this wasn't fixed. When I first saw Demon Haunts, I was immediately triggered because to me, this looked like just another Persona Particular. A shallow attempt at social simulation akin to the bar talk and text messages of Soul Hackers 2 and SMT 4 Apocalypse respectively. Just another vapid emulation of something Persona does better, but without the understanding of why it works in a series about psychology and why it didn't as implemented in the other 2 examples, bogging down the experience by dictating that the good ending be locked behind Soul Hackers 2's most boring feature and relegating important context of character development to missable messages in 4 Apocalypse. As such, I had wanted to skip it wholly when I first saw it. A comment that I got on my 6 Hopes video, however, was more optimistic and open-minded that this wouldn't be soul levels all over again, and fortunately, they were right. Demon Haunts are only a minor addition, amounting to a minor flare in a new move, improved stats, an extra item, or an odd level up, while the human characters just make some comment on what is occurring in the story to give some insight into what they are thinking and feeling. The feature honestly grew on me by the end of the game because it was just an optional extra that gave a benefit without feeling like a forced conformity to an entire separate game so as to appeal to an adjacent fanbase. Demon Haunts are instead a nice optional extra with some perks in adding extra interactions to the demons that already steal the show in negotiations as is, and being able to interact with them outside of battle for some funny or charming dialogue is a nice addition. One I'd actually like to see return in future games, given the surprising fun that I found with it. That's not to say that the concept is fully balanced. I do feel that it is a bit much to give extra stats to the player, or at least as much as free stats when one is plenty, but extra stats are there to exploit if you so choose. Regardless of it winning me over, it's still entirely optional outside of its introduction, where the visiting is forced. An issue that goes back to what I said before about not being able to skip the tutorial. This game feels the need to make sure that the player absolutely knows what has to be done, regardless of how obvious the feature is to access and how intuitive they are to grasp. Though, in the case of Demon Haunts, I guess I can understand, given that I was triggered by their inclusion and needed to be won over. One of the biggest things that this game needed to fix was balancing. A lot of people praised the gameplay, and I've always been baffled why. Platforming and the open world are very basic. Not terrible, not terrific. A perfectly serviceable first attempt, and I don't have much to say beyond that I've seen better and I've seen worse in that regard. And I'll always defend being able to Naruto run through a desert as an anime pretty boy. Combat is another matter. I've never been more bored playing an SMT game, and I've slogged through some of the 90s era stuff. And the fact that I can say that they're better balanced because damage isn't so dependent on level is a damning indictment to the original's quality. Given the trend of re-releases, it was a safe bet that this game would at least be balanced going in, even if it shouldn't have been an issue that needed to be fixed in the first place, given Atlus's track record with SMT games especially, and how obviously bad an idea the difference in level as the primary factor in damage calculations is. It still feels like something that should have been rectified a long time ago. Atlus saw fit to patch out some extra difficulty in one of the few dungeons because apparently a minor fix was more crucial to fix in the game rather than the very thing that the bulk of the gameplay is about, and frankly speaking, the game should have at least been balanced upon release. Fortunately, I can now confirm that the game is actually fun to play. Level is no longer the determining factor in damage calculations, with stats and affinities now having a greater impact, and bosses are no longer excessively bloated in HP to drag out the individual battles and the excessive grinding needed to keep up. There are still bosses who do feel bloated unnecessarily, but fortunately the vast majority of new bosses and layouts have been reworked to have a strong balance between strengths and weaknesses, making finding a strategy with the tools that the game provides that wins the match rewarding rather than relegating whoever wins the encounter to how high the difference in levels are above all else. For example, it took me 5 times to defeat the Hydra in my playthrough of the original, and I had to largely abandon the use of buffs in the battle because raw ice damage was just a better use of turns and pressed turns, whereas it only took me 2 times in my first playthrough of Vengeance, and with the aid of buffs and debuffs to greatly affect the outcome. Speaking of which, this brings me to buffs and debuffs proper, as they had been my main point of criticism in balancing in my 6 hopes video. Much like in Persona, they still wear off and can only be stacked twice, severely limiting their versatility, and I still stand by that this was done in an attempt to appeal more to Persona fans, given that game's trends of having buffs and debuffs be temporary. This causes the gameplay to feel more like Persona, and as a fan, I am prone to recommending that the games revert buffs and debuffs to their classic uses, and better design encounters around their use and exploitation, akin to the Matador fight in Nocturne, but at least the combat is now balanced around their use as they exist in this game. It is still annoying that they wear off and only stack twice, as this limits strategy and reduces the usefulness of cancelling moves, Dekunda and Dekaja, making them situational at best, and their costs too high to really bother with for most of the game, when I can just wait for the effects to wear off. The Zeus boss fight in the Empyrean is the exception, as his use of Dekunda early on, if debuffed on the first turn, forced me to rework my strategy and save Debilitate for the next turn, but he is the exception, not the rule, and the strategy presented was still rather limited. This is the big thing that I hope is fixed in future SMT games, and given that Atlus has a registered trademark for SMT 6, we'll just have to wait and see if this change becomes the standard or if it was just a one-off. Though some aspects have been fixed, one major component still feels off: the Magatsuhi skills. Some have been slightly tweaked and now resemble the fusion skills of Persona 3, of needing certain demons in stock to make use of them, but I'd hardly call the system balanced, because one of the best and most versatile is still the default, and an even more broken one, Omnipotent Succession, is given before the new dungeon. And it's too game breaking not to make use of, since it's essentially free attacks in succession for the price of one turn. I get the distinction that the return to 3D filled a lot of the developers with excitement, and this resulted in feature creep. It's been well documented that a lot of features had to be cut pretty late in development of the original, such as the Chaos Heroine, Yoko Hiramine herself, and the idea of riding Hayataro like a horse across the ruins of Tokyo. Magatsuhi skills to me reek of something similar. An idea to spice up the combat like smirking, but I just don't see the appeal of one big super move when compared to the more pragmatic choices to revolve combat around, and especially since the best skills are not restricted behind anything major. I honestly hope that Magatsuhi skills do not make a return, and instead the combat is more rooted in the more unique dynamic of losing and pressing turns that was already present, but a video on potential gameplay is for another time. The fourth thing that I had wanted addressed was for alignment to matter, and honestly, just the fact that this game managed the bare minimum is something. In SMT 5 and 4 Apocalypse, alignment had been boiled down to aesthetics made irrelevant by just selecting the ending at the 11th hour. The canon of Vengeance bucks this trend, and it's refreshing to finally see. When I first got the cutscene to decide the ending, I was sweating buckets just waiting for the choice to arise, and felt immensely relieved when that wasn't the case. Alignment does matter in the canon of Vengeance, but that doesn't mean that alignment is handled flawlessly, or that it doesn't have its lows. These hiccups in quality are primarily the results of the canon of Vengeance feeling the need to parallel the canon of Creation, and these lows correspond to when the story needs to conform the most. Alignment is non-existent in the first area, introduced a bit haphazardly in the second, but from its introduction onward, and especially into the third area, is handled spectacularly. Both Tao and Yoko have an organic perspective in why they feel and sympathize with who they do and why, while keeping the biases of each relatively balanced, and the game not taking a stand on who is in the right or wrong. Unfortunately, at the end of the third area and into the fourth, the game suddenly fumbles with alignment so extremely that it's jarring. This corresponds with a sudden drop in the writing quality that arises from the canon of Vengeance, again conforming too closely to the canon of Creation to really break free from it, sacrificing its own narrative in the process. Dazai's character is assassinated when he is essentially brainwashed by Mastema, rather than organically being radicalized into lawful extremist evil, as had been the intention in the original. This makes his actions feel a lot more hollow than how the developers had clearly intended, given that there is no build-up to Dazai going extreme beyond Mastema cryptically undoing his petrification to enact his plan, and he shows up with an entirely separate personality. Yoko also leaves the party for the whole of the fourth area, suddenly shifting perspective and leaving only Tao's lawful one intact during the few story-relevant instances. These things make the alignment go from feeling like an integral part of the story to an afterthought, given its sudden lack of relevancy. This may not have been a problem had this been a chaos path that occurred to deviate from the law path for the final area, but there isn't. The game feels like it goes full lawful after the fact by removing Yoko's input and having only Tao's perspective from then onwards. While I do appreciate that alignment does play a factor in the actual endings, getting to this point from the final area still feels a bit jarring because the game essentially forces a compulsory law path to the end goal until Yoko reappears at the 11th hour to offer a chaos ending alternative. And the fact that Mastema can just casually seize control of Tiamat to force a boss fight to parallel the Law one makes me feel like there was a lot of indecision about this final stretch of the game, forcing a contrivance to rectify what would have been a glaring plot hole without. Not helping matters is that a lot of the ideas that the game wants to comment on are said, but never really explored beyond. Yoko's past is rather obtuse, and her motivations are only revealed at the end of the third area. Another example of characters like Dazai, Yuzuru, Miyazu, and Sahori, whose arcs feel like they are preemptively cut short right as they are getting started, and the fact that all of these end before the fourth area, the part of the game most devoid of any real plot, since the agonizingly dull beginning, when any could have had a role to play during, only furthers my issues with the final stretch. At once rushed to completion, yet bloated with nothing of substance. A lot like the canon of creation, and it was disappointing to see. All this leaves me feeling rather conflicted. On one hand, I like what Vengeance did with alignment. It's honestly a breath of fresh air in a lot of ways during the middle part, but with a lot of noticeable lows, courtesy of conforming to the canon of creation's messy plot and pacing. And these lows are terrible enough to distract from the final product, resulting in it feeling a lot less thought-provoking than it was clearly trying to be. Overall, I'd say that alignment matters and that the developers clearly wanted to tackle an interesting angle, and did manage to lay the groundwork to tackle what they wanted to say. It's just that SMT V wouldn't let them say it. The penultimate thing that I had hoped for this game to improve on was the world design. One of the reasons why the world of SMT V felt hollow and vapid when compared to previous installments was because the world didn't feel lived in. Rather than the demons moving into and repurposing the ruins, making these areas feel lived in as opposed to abandoned of all semblance of life, in SMT V, the ruins were themselves typically vacant, while the demons just occupied the sandy fields outside them, which honestly make it feel like the desert was supposed to be the main appeal, as opposed to the factoid that this used to be an urban metropolis. I never expected this game to rearrange or recreate the buildings to be more interactable, but at least putting some NPCs with just some dialogue into some of the ones with an entrance would have worked wonders to make them feel like they were at least a hiding place or used as a shelter from the elements. For the record, I have no qualms with the uses of caves, deserts, oases, grassy fields, and sci-fi-esque appearing walkways, but I have to ask why these are the locales used, as opposed to the actual ruins of Tokyo beneath and around them. The whole point of using Tokyo as a setting is to use the city as an allegory for the cycle of destruction and resurrection of a society. For example, Mermaid is inhabiting a small oasis beneath a destroyed bridge. It sort of makes use of the environment as the cement ceiling provides cover from the sun and insulation to retain moisture, but how much more interesting would it have been if she had instead been in a flooded basement of a building? It would have been a more organic way to make use of a building, since it would have accomplished the same and changed nothing. The new Magatsuhi rails could have also been used to provide a good way to re-explore old buildings, as multiple unlock new ledges for exploration, but could have just been as easily used to access previously inaccessible parts of a building, such as a higher story of one of the many office buildings, and place the NPCs, side quest dialogue, and enemies in there as opposed to the ledges. What's more is that near the end of the first area, a side quest in finding a suitable home for a family of Halfas could have worked in finding them an abandoned building, and perhaps even have a follow-up to resurrect the building's AC with demon electricity, rather than just a cave. Caves are even somewhat suspect to include, since it implies that Tokyo has somehow sank into the earth, and again, abandoned buildings, which tend to be far scarier and more atmospheric than caves in my opinion, litter the horizon. I realize that some might not care as much about the immersion or the apocalyptic atmosphere as I do, and I never expected for Mermaid and Oni to be moved or for buildings to replace where they were. I was just using them as examples, but it still bugs me that one of the biggest issues that I had with the world design went unaddressed, and it is one of the major reasons why this game fails in atmosphere. I do want to end this off by saying that the new area is slightly better when it comes to world design, given the feel of the ruins being overtaken by nature and the ethereal feel to the flowers that only bloom when near the Nahobino, a welcome change from the color-swapped deserts of old, but the issue still largely persists, even if a handful of the new quests now place the NPCs in abandoned and still barren buildings. SMT 4 managed to capture the feel of long abandoned buildings far better through its grungy feel and the populace surviving underground where sanitary conditions were lacking, and though I do have my problems with it, Soul Hackers 2 at least managed to have the demons occupy realistic buildings, so there really isn't a good reason not to see this present in SMT 5, especially when their absence is felt and it only detracts from the experience. The vast open world feels needlessly barren, and the demons within don't feel as lively or independent as they do in other games, where they had been represented by random encounters, sprites with blood splatter effects, and minuscule textures, and that's honestly quite sad for a game that is visually rather impressive. And the final thing, which is something of a continuation of the world design, was better platforming. I don't think I articulated it very well in hindsight, but the point that I had wanted to make was that these blocks, with their distinctly artificial and refined look, were at odds with the post-apocalyptic aesthetic and the setting, and this was a pet peeve of mine when playing the game. Again, I have no qualms with this aesthetic in theory or in principle, but I have to question what they are doing scattered around the open world beyond making where to platform upwards as obvious as possible. In my opinion, the platforming should have been done with the debris and the buildings being used as the platforms to ascend space, rather than the very clear, out-of-place cubes that have always felt like they were more a placeholder for something else that didn't get replaced. I say this because there are stretches in the second area, especially where things like shipping crates are used as extra large staircases to get to a higher area, and debris from buildings and bridges are used in this way as well on occasion, which makes some segments of the second area especially feel a lot more well thought out with regards to how the player could scale upwards with what is present, begging the question of why the rest of the world isn't designed with this in mind. I didn't expect these blocks to be replaced, but I did want them to at least not be as prevalent in the new area, or for them to have some sort of justification to their existence in the narrative. There is no justification, and they are still pretty bad in the new area. It's not as bad as it could have been in fairness, but I still find their inclusion as a detriment to the construction of an immersive atmosphere, something that the series was once the gold standard in, and yet now seems to struggle to even get the basics right. And that's everything that I wanted to touch upon in this follow-up to my 6 Hopes video. Sorry this took so long, but a combination of technical issues and real-life family drama made me unable to record or edit for a few weeks, and it can be very difficult to muster motivation after episodes like these occur. Especially when I finally do get around to editing of this video, the power goes out, forcing me to redo a lot of it from scratch, which is another reason why this video isn't really edited all that much, with large portions of it just being a still image. However, that is behind me, and with that said, hopefully I should be back on a more consistent schedule October onwards, and I now want to make up for lost time. I have my next video slated for next week, and after that at least one more list of 6, the one voted on for my community tab almost done, and it should be out by the end of the month as well. In the meantime, on screen right now is a video that I personally recommend, and a video that YouTube recommends you, so why don't you watch one of those if you so feel like it.